In this lesson, we are going to continue solving quadratic equations, but this time the b will equal 0. So we'll solve simple radical equations and we put answers in simplest radical form. Remember, when you're solving an equation, you're going to use inverse operations. And also remember that when you take the square root of a number, you could possibly have two solutions. The square root of 9 could be 3 or negative 3. And when we write that, we can take our shortcut and have that be plus or minus 3. So, can we take the square root of all numbers? Can we take the square root of, say, the number 4? Absolutely. The square root of 4 could be positive or it could be negative 2. Can we take the square root of 0? Absolutely. The square root of 0 is 0. But can we take the square root of a negative number? What two numbers can I multiply together that are exactly the same that will give us a negative 9? In this case, there would be no solution in the real number system because I cannot multiply two numbers together that are exactly the same to give us a negative 9. So to solve radical equations, here's what we need to do. We need to get the x squared by itself. Then we need to take the square root of both sides. And please don't forget, remember the plus or minus. So let's take a look. We have x squared minus 36 equals 0. So we want to get the x squared by itself. The first thing we're going to do is to add 36 to both sides. So we have x squared is equal to 36. And since we have the x squared alone, now we will do the opposite operation, which is to take the square root of both sides. So we have x is equal to plus or minus, don't forget that, and the square root of 36 is 6. In the next example, we want to get the x squared by itself. So the first thing that we're going to do is to add 98 to both sides. So we have 2x squared is equal to 98. We want to get the x squared by itself, so we're going to divide both sides by 2. So we have x squared is equal to 49. And then to simplify, since the x squared is now by itself, we're going to do the opposite operation, which is take the square root of both sides. A square and a square root cancel each other, so x is equal to, don't forget your plus or minus, the square root of 49 is 7. In our next example, first thing that we want to do is to get the x squared by itself, so we're going to subtract 6 from both sides. So we have 2x squared is equal to 0. Then we're going to divide by 2. So we have x squared is equal to 0. And since we have the x squared by itself, we're going to take the square root of both sides. So x is equal to, and in this instance, because 0 is neither positive nor negative, we don't need the plus or minus. The square root of 0 is 0. In the next example, we want to get x squared by itself, so we're going to subtract 4 from both sides. So we have x squared is equal to a negative 4. Since the x squared is by itself, we're going to take the square root of both sides. But please remember that the square root of a negative number isn't possible in the real number system, so this would be no solution. Let's take a look at our next example. We have 4x squared minus 25 is equal to 0. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add 25 to both sides. So we have 4x squared is equal to 25. Now we're going to divide by 4 to get the x squared by itself. So we have x squared is equal to. Now notice what we want to do. We can recognize right away that this fraction, we'll be able to take the square root of that because both of those are perfect squares. So we do not want to change that to a decimal. So we have x is equal to, after taking the square root of both sides, and the square root cancel, plus or minus, the square root of 25 is 5, and the square root of 4 is 2. So we have plus or minus 5 over 2. You can simplify that to be 2.5 or 2.5, or just leave it as 5 over 2. In the next example, we'll subtract 8 from both sides. So we have x squared is equal to 112. So now that the x squared is by itself, we want to take the square root of both sides. So we have x is equal to plus or minus. Now, because 112 is not a perfect square, we want to make sure to put our answers in simplest radical form. So we need to make a factor tree. So what can go into 112 evenly? Well, we know that 2 can, and that would be 2 times 56. So we split up 56 into 7 times 8, and we split up 8 into 4 times 2, and into 2 times 2. So we have 2 pairs of 2's, which means that the 4 can come outside. 2 2's is 4, and then our 7 will stay under the radical. So x is equal to plus or minus 4 square roots of 7. Please remember when you're solving quadratic equations where the b or the middle term is 0, you want to isolate the x squared, get it by itself. Then once you do that, you take the square root of both sides. Please don't forget to use your plus or minus sign so that you have both of your answers, with the exception of if the squared is 0, that would be 0, or if there is no solution. Please make sure to put your answers in simplest radical form unless they are perfect squares. And remember, we can't take the square root of a negative number in the real number system. Please remember to complete the reflection.